Thank the member and call the member for Macarthur.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is a bill that I'm really strongly opposed to, and in contrast to the previous speaker, there are alternatives to the cashless debit card, and that involves putting in proper social supports for families that have difficulties. Now, this is a philosophical problem. Look, it's quite ironic that on a day we're talking about, or we're arguing about whether we should give tax cuts to people earning $200,000 a year, that we're arguing about whether we should extend the reach of the cashless debit card. Now, I have no problem with espousing my objections to this bill. It's paternalistic. There are really no evidence that it is going to change anything. And in fact, for some families and some children, it is very likely to make things worse. If there is a problem with gambling, try and look at the gambling issues. Why do we have so many poker machines? Why do we allow people such free access to poker machines? Now, this is a government that is happy to support the poker machine industry, but not happy to support families in distress. Now, I don't like it when politics becomes personal, but to me this is a personal issue. This is a government that is prepared to see the most disadvantaged families in our community be punished for being in the position that they're in and not support them. And this is how I see the cashless debit card. There's no evidence that it works. There is very little effort being put in place to increase services for families in distress. In fact, we've learnt recently that the Minister for Indigenous Affairs is reducing support for drug and alcohol counselling for Indigenous families. So it's no good for those on the other side to say there are no alternatives. There are, and that's to provide proper supports for families in distress. In the Labor Party, we support the will of the community, and from what I hear and see, there is no evidence that the community strongly wants the cashless debit card introduced, in spite of what those on the other side say. We have backed community-led trials in the past, but there is no real evidence that's been produced that shows that the cashless debit card is of benefit to these extremely distressed families. Now, yes, many of these families are Indigenous, but there are others, and indeed in my electorate many people are very concerned about the prospect of the cashless debit card be given wider acceptance. And I think they should be rightly concerned, because this is a government that looks at punishing the poor and supporting the wealthy. What I truly doubt is the cashless debit card's capacity to deliver substantial and lasting benefits over the longer term. I think before we introduce social security measures to the poorest in our community, we should be very sure that they work before we punish them further. I've worked with these families for many years. They love their kids, they love their families, but they have difficulties. We need to change the argument. Families who have drug and alcohol problems have medical problems. These are medical problems. And we need to look what we can do to support them. A huge issue in my community is homelessness and the difficulty in getting stable housing. That is one way where the government could help these families. The ability to have a stable place of residence is extremely important for many of these very stressed families, particularly in terms of their children getting a stable education. I see families that have to move their kids to school all the time as their housing changes, and the lack of stability of housing is a very important social determinant not only of their health but of their learning. And yet we see a government that's doing very little to improve housing, particularly Indigenous housing, and particularly Indigenous housing in rural and remote areas. So there are alternatives to this punitive measure, and that's to provide proper social supports, something that this government does not appear to acknowledge. We have increasing numbers of children in out-of-home care, particularly Indigenous children. And this government seems to want an argument that we should adopt all those children into other families. What they don't look at is wraparound supports for these very distressed families. Once again, this is a government that's intent on punishing the poor and supporting the top end of town. The cashless debit card, the way it works is that it can be used for purchases, except for gambling and drugs, alcohol, tobacco, etc. It's run by a company called Inju, and it can be used in any sort of bricks and mortar store that accepts the Visa debit card, unless the store's been blocked, and I believe a few have been. It can also be used online. 80% of an individual's welfare payments are used in the cashless debit card, with the remaining 20% being placed in their ordinary savings account. It is removing these families from the ability to manage their own finances. So rather than putting in place ways that they can be helped to manage their finances, we're restricting how they can use their income, and we're not giving them any training in the ability to manage their own finances. So it's, again, a further punishment without a solution. We've seen the government wanting to roll this out town by town, community by community. Now, I am very concerned, as indeed are many people in my community, that the government will roll this out eventually around the country without any discussion and without any proper debate. What we see lacking in this government is any understanding of entrenched disadvantage, of multi-generational disadvantage. Now, I've worked in my community now for 35 years, so I've seen many generations of disadvantage, and I agree it is a major entrenched problem in a very wealthy country like Australia. What I don't see is any understanding or any proposal from this government to deal with entrenched multi-generational disadvantage. It's all about punishment. It's all about personal responsibility and blaming people for being sick or being disadvantaged. And I think that it really is time, when we are having this debate, as I've mentioned, about giving tax cuts to people earning $200,000 a year, it really is time that we try and look at lifting up those most disadvantaged in our community. And that is occurring in education, in health, in jobs, in housing. We need an overall proposal to try and help people on this multi-generational level. And unless we do that, we are going to continue with this piecemeal punishment, blaming, really them versus us type mentality. And I feel very sad about that, because I've been brought up in a very wealthy country, and there needs to be some acknowledgement that we need to be doing better for those that are most disadvantaged. We know that the vast majority of income support recipients can manage their own finances if they can be taught to do so. And in my own electorate of Macarthur, the St Vincent de Paul Society, amongst many, provides some fantastic financial management programs for the most disadvantaged. In fact, at their centre in Campbelltown, they're able to provide interest-free loans. They're able to teach people how to deal with their finances. They're able to try and show them how to manage their housing and their nutrition for their children in an overall package. And they do that by providing comprehensive supports. And they do it in a blameless way, in a way that doesn't blame people for being disadvantaged. In spite of what the Prime Minister talks about opportunity and reaping the rewards of hard work, things happen to people often through not their own fault, and they end up in disadvantage. We know that we've had increasing numbers of gambling outlets around the country with poker machines, the sports betting companies, the online gambling, and to me that is a huge problem, and we know that it causes problems often in those most disadvantaged. We've recently had the rollout in my electorate of the payday lending now being available through a machine at Minto in one of the very disadvantaged areas of my electorate. Now, what the government should be doing is trying to prevent things like that happening, that will put people at more disadvantage, rather than punishing them by introducing the cashless debit card. It really is not about trying to improve things and to help people. It's by trying to corral people already extremely disadvantaged in a continuing cycle of disadvantage, and something that I feel very sad about. We need to look at more radical ways of helping people. We need to look at wraparound services for these very disadvantaged families. One of my paediatric colleagues who works in a very remote rural area has spoken to me about not removing children from very disadvantaged families, but having areas where these families can go, where they can be given wraparound support, where they can stay with their children and be given help with things like drug and alcohol counselling, help with nutrition, help with their medical problems, and these families often have quite significant chronic medical disorders as well. So that we're looking at more a way of countering this multi-generational disadvantage. Once again, the cashless debit card is really very likely to, I believe, to compound and continue this cycle. Now, I know that you know, at first sight, it may well be an initial way of seemingly preventing people getting their drugs and their alcohol. In fact, we know that people who have addictions, and don't forget addiction is a medical problem, people who have addictions will get their drugs and alcohol in any way they can. And that may well mean turning to crime, using their cashless debit card to get things and then on-selling them. This really is not an answer, in spite of what those on the other side may think. Now, I would counsel those in the Liberal National Party to really think about what they're doing and think about more comprehensive and more appropriate services for the disadvantaged, rather than continuing to blame them. We really, I think, have had enough of blaming the poor and had enough of trying to corralling those with social disadvantage in a continuing cycle of poverty and a continuing cycle of dependency, and we need to look at more comprehensive ways of getting them out of that. I see the cashless debit card as being part of this, and I am strongly opposed to it. I would encourage members opposite to come into the most disadvantaged areas of their communities and ask them what they think they need. Because I think this paternalistic attitude of imposition from above and then not providing support services is becoming a characteristic of this government. And we've seen this with the cutbacks in Centrelink staff, the difficulties accessing Centrelink for very disadvantaged people. Not infrequently I have people come into my office who have no computer skills at all, asking me and my staff to help them access Centrelink supports. They have no idea, including recently an 88-year-old lady asking for that support. And I think that's very sad and a demonstration of a philosophical problem with the Liberal National Party government. They do not understand the issues of the most disadvantaged, and I feel very, very sad about that. Now, there has been a lot of research work undertaken by those who've had a lifetime in the field of social supports, and there are, we know, social determinants of a whole range of things, including health and education. And I would encourage those on the other side to have a look at the social determinants of these things and see what they can do to break the cycle. The continued extension of the cashless debit card is really avoiding looking at the problem and looking for solutions.
Time has
Thank you.
expired. I thank the member and call the